Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Yo Kim. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida reiterated his intention to work toward a summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. His remark came as North Korean leader's sister, Kim Yo-jong, bluntly rejected the idea of holding a summit between North Korea and Japan. Today, we discuss if the possibility of a summit remains on the table with two North Korea watchers in Washington.
日朝間でこの実りある関係を実現することは、これはこの日朝双方の利益にも合致する。
Our alliance, the alliance between Japan and the United States, is truly the cornerstone of peace, security, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific.
두 당 두 나라 인민의 공동의利益을 확고히 수호하며 중조 친선을 발전시켜 나갈 것이라고.
In the studio with me, Mr. Scott Snyder, incoming president and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Previously, Mr. Snyder was Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's latest book is the U.S.-South Korea Alliance, Why It May Fail and Why It Must Not. Also joining us, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So first, Mr. Klingner, Kim Yo-jong abruptly rejected any further contact or negotiation with Japan, and it was just one day after Kim Yo-jong revealed that North Korea was contacted by Japan over a possible summit. But Prime Minister Kishida seems to be persistent. He reiterated his going to continue his effort to have a summit with Kim Jong-un. There's a skepticism about feasibility of the North Korea-Japan summit. Do you see there's a still glimmer of a hope?
I think it's a very small glimmer. This process apparently has been in work for about a year. Prime Minister Kishida and other senior officials have been saying for a year that they would like to have a summit. And there were reports that last April or May, there were secret talks between Japan and North Korea. So it has been a longer process than perhaps it first appears to be. I think North Korea was trying to draw out Japan, sort of dangle a summit and perhaps progress on issues of concern to Japan, and also trying to drive a wedge between Japan and South Korea and the United States. Japan was eager for some kind of dialogue. We haven't really had dialogue with North Korea for 4.5 years from the U.S. and South Korea's side. But when North Korea imposed conditions on that they wouldn't talk about nuclear weapons, they wouldn't talk about the abductee issue, Japan wasn't willing to go that far. So I think it's a success for trilateralism and the coordination amongst the three nations that Japan wasn't willing to go down a path that perhaps fulfilled only their objectives, but not the objectives of the three countries together.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, North Korea is well known for its tactic of flip-flopping its positions. But still, Kim Yo-jong's giving out completely contradictory message in a day seems to be a little bit rare. So considering Japan has always been consistent on abduction issue, even though a summit takes place, do you think there will be any fruitful result?
Well, no, I'm not really expecting a fruitful result. And actually, I agree fully with what Bruce had to say about wedge driving. And I think that what's interesting is that it only took a day for this evidence that wedge driving was not going to work to come to fruition because, as Bruce suggested, North Korea publicly set aside the abduction issue and the nuclear issue as topics for discussion. the government of Japan indicated that they wanted to talk about those issues, and North Korea pulled the plug. And so I think that basically the main lesson is that even if you were able to get to negotiations, there would not be anything that would come of it, because North Korea was trying to achieve all of its negotiating objectives before it actually got to the negotiating table.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, earlier this year, Kim Jong-un sent a message of condolences to Japan over the earthquake, and he addressed Prime Minister Kishida with a very respectful honorific in a highest form possible. And a diplomatic tug over a possible summit was continuing since then. What do you think was the reason behind North Korea's apparent olive branch in the beginning?
Well, so that wasn't the first step. So the talks between Japan and North Korea had been going on behind the scenes for some time. So I think this was North Korea's sort of signal that we're willing to continue this process. It's a way of continuing to try to draw Japan out on the sort of the driving a wedge, seeing if they could cull Japan away from the herd. And so Japan responded, and we continued this process. But then when Kim Yo-jong was saying, well, you know, senior authorities don't think this is a good idea, but, you know, perhaps it's useful. So she was playing the good cop instead of her usual bad cop role. And then, you know, but she did lay down the conditions. And then when Japan made clear that they weren't going to accept those conditions, then I think she, you know, reversed to her bad cop role and said, well, then we're not going to have these meetings. And with some insults added in of how Kishida was only doing this because his public approval ratings are so poor, and, you know, getting a few kind of snarky comments in, as I think she's known to do.
Even though North Korea says they're not interested in having talk with Japan, I mean, look at past few days, they're constantly releasing these statements about Japan. Does that show you that North Korea is still interested in having talk with Japan?
If they're interested, it's highly conditional. So they've laid out the parameters of what they would be willing to talk about, which don't include issues of interest to Japan as well as the United States and South Korea. So I think they're leaving the offer on the table, but expecting Japan to cross a few red lines, which it doesn't appear Tokyo is willing to do. So Pyongyang has rejected all South Korean and U.S. entreaties for talks or dialogue, let alone negotiations. It seemed willing to try to pull Japan away from the rest of the countries. But right now it seems they're more willing to just reject all entreaties for dialogue.
Mm-hmm. There have been reports that U.S. and Japan are working towards upgrading the U.S. forces Japan command structure. It is viewed to enhance the joint operational planning and exercises in response to China's military rise. How should we understand the direction and the form of the adjustment of this military alliance between the United States and Japan?
Well, we're anticipating Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Washington in just a couple of weeks. And so this is a time when we should focus on potential deliverables. And I think that one of the big issues between the U.S. and Japan at this point is really how to enhance deterrence as related to China, and that also means being prepared to do joint warfighting. And between the U.S. and Japan, there's a lot of work to be done, I would say, in order to truly achieve an effective deterrent posture that would be capable of doing that. One of my colleagues, Chris Johnstone, referred to this revision of the structure that is anticipated as pushing the U.S.-Japan alliance closer to being able to fight tonight, which is what the U.S.-South Korea alliance is already capable of doing. And so I really see this development primarily in the context of trying to make sure that we indeed are capable and prepared to be able to respond to a Taiwan contingency. And I really see that the impact on South Korea ultimately is going to be more related to whether or not we can also enhance trilateral coordination in ways that maybe develop either a division of labor or some form of shared and coordinated strategy for achieving the objective of deterrence against Chinese provocations, which is in the shared interest of all three countries.
Mr. Klingner, do you also see the primary goal of this military adjustment is deterring China? And if so, how significant a message would this send to China?
Well, I think even more broadly, it's addressing a long-time deficiency in the U.S.-Japan military relationship. If you look at the U.S.-South Korean Combined Forces Command, which is integrated, it's very efficient. It's really the model for alliance warfighting capability. U.S. forces Japan and Japan, they're really parallel quarterbacks on the field. And as Defense Department people have pointed out, is the Commander U.S. Forces Japan doesn't even control his own forces. It's like a quarterback on a field who can't tell his players what to do. He has to call back to the coach or Indo-PACOM to tell the players what to do. So it's really been a long time inefficient manner of trying to respond to any kind of contingency, not only Taiwan or China or the Korean Peninsula. So any kind of improvement, I think, would be very beneficial, not only to the U.S. and Japan, but also Korea, because we can't defeat North Korea without Japan's involvement. So Japan really plays a pivotal role in not only Taiwan operations, but also Korean Peninsula operations.
How will the change of the U.S. forces in Japan will affect the current structure of the U.S. forces Korea?
Well, we're not really sure what will be the results announced during the Biden-Kishida summit. But as I said, any improvement in the efficiency of military operations, between the U.S. and Japan, whether it's truly combined or truly joint, any step forward is better than the current situation. It will make U.S. forces interaction with Japan more efficient, and we need that not only for Taiwan, but also peninsula operations. There are 7 UN command rear bases in Japan, which are critical for defeating North Korea of any kind of attack on South Korea. Not only do we need access to those 7 bases, we're going to need access to more bases, Japanese bases, for the throughput of U.S. forces, as well as the UN member states, formerly called sending states, or member nations. So the better the relations are between Japan and Korea, the better the efficiencies are between the U.S. and Japan, really benefits all 3 countries.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, including Taiwan, there's regional conflicts potentially escalating. There's a strong possibility that U.S. forces in Korea could be deployed around Korean Peninsula. How would strengthening the U.S. forces in Japan would affect U.S. forces in Korea? And will it have any effect for North Korea as well?
Yeah. Well, I agree with Bruce that it also has some potential benefits in terms of being able to enhance our capability to respond to a North Korean contingency. But I think that the key issue really that I think you're trying to drill down on is whether or not or how an enhanced U.S.-Japan coordination and possibly joint warfighting role would influence the alliance. And I think that the intent is really to have those developments in the U.S.-Japan bilateral relationship then flow into new things that we can do trilaterally among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And so this just points back to the significance of Camp David and the fact that having 2 allies work more closely together really raises the ceiling for what we can do in relationship to peace and stability in the region compared to where it was before, where we were really operating with our arm tied behind our back.
Mr. Klingner, Japan has long had this standing of exclusively defense-oriented military posture, and it is now seeking, obviously, to become a country that can wage war, which worries many countries in the region, including South Korea. Japan has already committed to increasing its defense budget to 2% of GDP by 2027. And it plans also to acquire 400 US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles. Do you think US's active support for this Japan's expanded military role in the region could lead to some conflicts among allies in the region, including South Korea?
Well, the only countries that are worried about Japan improving its military are South Korea, North Korea, and China. And what Japan is doing is improving its ability to protect its country and protect other allies. So in 2015, 2016, when it adopted collective self-defense, it was now going to be able to protect those nations that was protecting it. And what we've seen is with the growing North Korean and Chinese threats, we need our allies to step up to the plate. And so in many ways, Japan was a bit of a drain on coalition operations, given the previous restrictions they had. And now we see that they are actually going to more fully fund their military needs, clearly driven by the concern about Chinese operations against Taiwan. And having counterstrike capabilities, and they have emphasized that they will use those capabilities only after they have first been attacked, perhaps by North Korea or by China. So they are counterstrike capabilities. So any way of improving Japanese capabilities, US capabilities, South Korean capabilities really works to the benefit of all of us, whichever the contingency is. So Japan has no claims or desires to go to the Korean Peninsula other than a way of helping allied operations against North Korea. So Japan is not a military threat to its democratic neighbors.
Mr. Snyder, I think many South Korean people will be curious what is the main stream thought in Washington. Aren't there concerns deep in Washington's inner circle that the military capability of Japan, or Germany for that matter, that there should be some kind of limit to that? And for like Japan, United States is encouraging Japan to expand their military capability, but to extend the level that can contain China's military growth.
Yeah, so I think what you're really referring to is the cork in the bottle theory, that somehow we need to try to contain Japan's military capabilities. But I think that in light of the growing threat from China, which is really the true driver, increasingly the US and Japan find themselves likely to need each other in order to be able to match and exceed the growth in China's military budget and capabilities. And so in that context, I think that what that means is that concerns about Japan's military capabilities growing too fast are kind of washed away, and in fact there's probably greater concern about whether or not Japan's military capabilities are growing fast enough.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, I want to focus on North Korea's recent diplomatic efforts. North Korean delegation has recently visited China, and North Korea is showing overt closeness with Russia. Do you see there's any possible trilateral alliance strengthening among Russia, China, North Korea?
I think it's really a series of bilateral relationships, sort of a trilateral collection of bilateral relationships. It's not a true alliance, but any improvement amongst those three countries is worrisome to the US and its Asian as well as European partners. So the North Korean support to Russian operations in Ukraine, that directly impacts US strategic interests in Europe as well as those of our NATO allies. And then whatever North Korea is getting in return for that, even if it's just financial or economic assistance, which helps Pyongyang undermine the effectiveness of international sanctions, that's worrisome. And if Russia is providing some kind of military technology to North Korea, well, then that increases the threat to our allies in the region. So, and we've seen China helping Russia out economically. So these three rogue nations are working together as a way of offsetting international community's responses to their heinous operations or heinous actions. So, when they work together, even if it's not a true alliance where they would militarily come to the other's assistance, it is undermining U.S. strategic interest and those of our democratic partners.
Mm. In the latest development, United Nations Security Council failed to extend the mandate of a UN panel on North Korea. How significant was this event?
Well, I think that it was described by one analyst as catastrophic. And in fact, it does, I think, represent essentially a dismantling of some of the infrastructure for enforcement of the UN Security Council resolutions that have been passed against North Korea. It also represents a strategic return on investment for Pyongyang in developing its relationship with Moscow. But I think that one indicator of exactly what the significance is was provided by the South Korean ambassador to the UN, Hwang Jun-guk, who said that this is almost comparable to destroying a CCTV to avoid being caught red-handed. So I think that that aptly characterizes the fact that we are losing capability to be able to monitor and enforce North Korean violations of sanction resolutions, and that Russia is moving from passive resistance against sanctions to overt defiance of those sanctions.
Mr. Klingner, the opposition in South Korea criticized the Yoon Suk-yeol government for being too biased toward U.S. diplomacy and neglecting diplomacy toward China. There are even some views criticizing whether South Korea should care about what is happening in Taiwan and over Taiwan Strait. Is conflict between Taiwan and China, is it relevant to South Korea?
Very much so. Korea, under successive administrations, has tried to keep its head down out of concern that, quite rightly, the North Korean threat is an existential threat, but also fear of Chinese retribution if Korea even criticizes Beijing by name. And so what we've seen is that whereas Japan and Australia and other democratic nations will not only criticize Chinese actions but identify Beijing as a perpetrator, South Korea doesn't want to go that far, even under the Yoon administration. So it's fearful of Chinese actions. And under President Yoon, he's adopted a more principled, a more values-based policy, security policy, foreign policy. But even he's pulling his punches. And so he talks about Korea being a global pivotal state. He talks about values-based analysis. Well, the actions have not fully matched the words. And so whether it's not providing direct lethal aid to Ukraine or very high-value speeches, but Korea is trying to keep its head down in a Taiwan situation. If Taiwan is controlled by China, it directly undermines South Korean strategic interests. And Korea should be trying to protect those values, not only with Taiwan, but throughout the Indo-Pacific. So Korea's got skin in the game, but to be in the game, you got to be on the court.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, in the event of a war between China and Taiwan, wouldn't South Korea be an interested party, whether it wants it to be or not?
South Korea would not only be an interested party, as Bruce was suggesting, they would be directly involved. Because, for instance, if there is some kind of Chinese invasion of Taiwan, then China also has to be concerned about U.S. forces in the region, including U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula. And so that would draw Korea in. Or, alternatively, if there's a conflict across the straits and North Korea sees an opportunity to take advantage, it's likely that horizontal escalation could occur in that form. And so that would mean, again, that South Korea would be drawn in. So I think that it's prudent for the U.S. and South Korea to have an active discussion about the possible ways in which South Korea could be affected by a Taiwan conflict. And I think that it's prudent for South Korea to prepare accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the time we've got for today. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yes.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region, right here in Washington.